One of the questions that has come up is how can you move multiple objects and animate them and work with them? So say something is composed of a whole bunch of different things, like a person, which has arms and legs and hands and eyes and nose and all of that. There's not necessarily a great way that we can accomplish that in Flash, but there are a couple of different ways. If I have multiple objects that I want to animate across my screen and work with, so ooh, look, he smiles, jumps out of there, and do that, if I'm animating multiple objects together, one thing that I can do is I can now extend them out, and we'll just go onto these objects, and I will turn on and choose Create Motion Tween, so now I have some time. And once you've created a motion tween, right-click and choose Create Motion Tween either on the object or in the layer. And notice I had to do it on the section of the layer that had content. That is something that is important. If I right-click out here, Create Motion Tween is grayed out because I'm not selecting content. That's something that came up last class, so that's important to pay attention to. So if I right-click on a given layer, I can choose Create Motion Tween. If I highlight multiple layers, I can then do it in one fell swoop and say Create Motion Tween, and it applies to multiple layers. Now the advantage of doing that is now if I move something, it automatically is inserting a keyframe to represent the movement or motion that has now occurred there. And now if I decide that I want to take my blue that I have here, I can move that over there. And that's now moved at the beginning, go somewhere else in time. If I move it, it automatically is inserting keyframes. We can see that by the little diamond that it's dropping into the timeline. It gives me this little diamond. When you are dealing with keyframes, if I want to adjust where that keyframe is, I can get to it again by clicking on that keyframe, so it's now selected, and then click and drag. So it's a two-step process. Click, then click and drag, then I can move where that keyframe is. But if I just try and click and drag it, it now highlights, and it's like, well, that's not what I wanted. If I want to move that keyframe, click, and now I can click and drag, and now that adjusts when I get to that point. Now I can move somewhere else and move that. So we can see, well, this is the one I was trying to grab. So it can move things around. Now, one thing to remember that you've probably experienced by now is when you add a new layer, that layer is automatically as long as whatever the current maximum layer time is already. So if you've animated 200, 300, 400 frames of time, you add one new layer, it's automatically that long. So now when I do anything on this layer, so if I go and grab a paintbrush, choose a different color, and on this layer, it's a plant or explosion or whatever the case may be. We'll notice it now exists for this entire duration. But if I don't want it to show up until after the other layers that are already there, then we might need to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to undo that. And there's a couple of different ways. I could have taken what I drew and moved its keyframe out, but I could also add an empty keyframe at this point in time further out in space by hitting F7 on the keyboard. And now it adds an empty keyframe, and now when I draw something, it exists out here later in time. So we can see that it now took place later. If that keyframe, if I click on it and move it to the beginning here, we can now see it's here. So we can move keyframes around, and we do that by clicking on them and then clicking and dragging them to a new location. And then that will now move that keyframe to a new location. So as you're trying to adjust some of the timing of elements that you've worked with, this can be a very useful thing to remember. Click on the keyframe and then click and drag that keyframe to the point that you want it to be. So that's the first important thing to deal with. Now, what this hasn't taught us yet is how do we deal with something or move multiple things at the same time. So now if I'm here, Oh, I'm sorry, I was using my paintbrush. I couldn't figure out why it kept yelling at me. I was trying to select something, but when you select with a paintbrush, it's like, no, you can't paint there because that's not a paintable layer. So if I move this to this location, if this is here, if I want two objects to move together, so if I want to extend these out, I can just go out in time, highlight multiple layers, and hit F5 to extend my layers out. If I select the face, if I select the orange water, together, I can now move them as a unit, and now it inserts a keyframe for both of them. So if I have a character composed of 1, 2, 10, 20, 50 layers, I can select all of the layers of just that character and move them to a new position. What we don't have in Flash is we don't have the ability to create what would be in After Effects a null object, in Animate Pro a peg, where it's a control handle that we can now attach to multiple things, that I move that one control and it affects everything that's attached to it. We don't have that option to do that in Flash, so it does add some challenge or difficulty while we're trying to then animate. So that is something that would be nice to have. Now sometimes what is done to overcome this is, let's say I want to now decide that I want a version of my little alien head here and the orange water, and I want them to be kind of embedded together so that I only have to move one object and it moves both of them. And what we can do with that is we can now create an additional symbol that's composed of these other two objects. So I can select, by holding down the Shift key, I can select two objects here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy those objects. I don't want to turn this selection here into a symbol, because that would actually kind of screw up the animation I already have. And this is where, when we're working with symbols, we can make a symbol out of existing symbols, and then we can take multiple composite symbols and make a new symbol out of that, and a new symbol. So we can kind of nest things layer upon layer upon layer upon layer deep until your head wants to explode. That's just what we can do, and it works out okay. So if I have objects selected, if I copy that, then what I'm going to do is choose Insert New Symbol. This is now creating a new symbol. Previously, when we converted things to symbols, we used F8 or modify Convert to Symbol. But I want to make a brand new symbol, and this new symbol will be alien on water. It's more in the water, but on will work. And now what I can do is I can paste, there he is inside that structure. Now if we look up at the top here, we'll see scene 1. Oh. And then I was inside my alien on water. So I have my alien symbol, my ground symbol, my water symbol, alien on water. I am going to, I don't want that there anymore. I'm going to go right here and hit F7 so I can start fresh and clean. Alien on water is here. And now if I want to line this up with what was there before, so we can see it doesn't quite line up, but we do have the ability to turn on onion skinning in Flash, so we can now see a range of multiple frames. So now I can see where, so we can see there was where he started. Now I can move over to here and line it up. And when you're trying to move things around, you can always use the arrow keys until you get it perfectly lined up. And then use comma and period to go back and forth. And we can see I'm probably not quite there. At this point I'm going to turn off onion skinning and now comma period. So we can see when I'm on back he's up a little bit, then he goes down. So on this frame, select him up, over, oh, too high. Now I toggle between the frames, comma period, and there's no change. So now that I've done that, I can now take this new symbol and I could choose Create Motion Tween, I can now add more time using F5. Oh, apparently I missed when I chose create motion tween. Add more time, and now we can move it over as we see fit. And now I only had to move one item, and it's only moving on one layer. So there will be times where you will make additional symbols that are composed of other symbols that you've been animating so that you can work a little bit more efficiently. The key thing to worry about, or not worry about, is the number of layers. Don't worry if you end up with 50 or 100 or 200 layers. It's no big deal to have lots of layers. If your layer list gets really hard to scroll through, you can always click and add a folder, and then you can put a whole bunch of layers into that folder, so then you can just collapse that folder and it now minimizes your timeline, so you don't have to see as much. Using folders can be a great way to organize your timeline a little bit and keep things working a little bit smoother. So the artwork is still there. I can uncollapse the folder and we can see it's still there. Now we have everything moving. The next technique of doing fades to and from black, you can do fades to and from any color. It doesn't matter, but typically from a film or cinema standpoint, we always seem to use black because then you have the black screen of the theater and then you kind of magic appears. And the same techniques for doing those fades are the same techniques we'll use for fading in and out different title graphics or title sequences and words, and we'll just take a look at that. One thing to bear in mind is when you are working with your project, if you have a specific font that you use and it's on your computer, and then you turn your file in and expect me to see it on this computer, if I don't have access to install that font, I will not be able to see your text in that font. It will require me to choose some other text, which will ruin your otherwise awesome project. So if you use other than just real basic default fonts, you either need to make your text so it's no longer text and that it's just shapes, and we'll cover that, or you need to provide the font to me, or both, and then it's good. So first, to do the fade, a few things to remember here is this is the area, the white area, that's my stage. And if I want to do a fade, I need to have something that is going to be as big or bigger than my stage. So I'm choosing the black rectangle. I chose my color of fill, or of color of black as my fill. I'll add a new layer to build this on. I drew a rectangle. It's bigger than the stage, so I know it's bigger. Turn off, turn on, we can see that. Now, if you're one of those who've worked with outlines of vector-shaped objects in Illustrator and cool stuff like that, that's what this color column is with the boxes. I click there and it shows me that layer as outlines. So I don't necessarily have to turn everything off. I can just turn on outlines and see what I have drawn. You may have discovered that by accident. You clicked and you're like, crap, where did my artwork go? And then you see the hollow box instead of that. And we can just click the box up top here that locks or unlocks everything, or outlines and unoutlines everything. Good practice is to always lock all your layers while you're working except the layer you're trying to work on. That prevents you from screwing up or adding artwork to the wrong layer and making a mess. You start erasing things. Why is it not erasing? And you've now erased your artwork on a previous layer, and then you cry, and it's just not good. It'll be like someone stole your Halloween candy. So now I've drawn my black box. We will notice it as I drew it, it extended across the timeline of my whole project. We will modify that because I don't want my whole thing to be black the whole time. If I want to control and fade this, the best way to do that is to take this object and convert it to a symbol. So I'd hit F8 on the keyboard, and I will call this my big black box. And it's now a symbol. So now it's ready for me to do something to it. So now that this is a symbol, I will be modifying its properties, specifically its color effect. Now, if you have worked in things like Photoshop before, you will notice that we also have display modes, so we can choose our different display modes like we may have had in Photoshop, so we can work with that. We can also modify coloring. We can change brightness, tinting, alpha or transparency, or advanced, which allows me to change the RGB and alpha component of this entire object. So I can now modify that, and it is something that is keyframeable. So I have my object here. It has its starting keyframe. It's a good practice at the beginning. Without the whole thing highlighted there. Click here at the beginning, hit F6 to make sure, not F7. All right, we'll just leave it as F6. It wants to add an extra. I don't want that. Click on my object, make sure it's not covering, or is covering everything. And now what I can do is decide I am going to have it black there, and I want to do a color tween, so I turn on tweening. And now I'm going to just hit F6, click on the object, color effect. Remember, F6 is always for adding in a keyframe. Color effect, alpha. And now I can just pull it down. Now, one thing to notice is if I pull it down to 0 and click off it, we cannot see that that box is there. But I will suggest to you something slightly different. Instead of setting it at 0, I go down to about 10%. So now we can see there's a little difference between the artwork in the background, 10% opaque. Because now when it fades, so if it goes, ooh, look, we're fading from black. Fade from black. If I decide that this now should happen faster, I can pull this down. Somehow I ended up with an extra keyframe there. We'll clean that out. So we can see it fades out, and the difference between 10% and nothing, while we see a little bit of difference when the movie's actually playing, it still seems to fade out reasonably smooth. That allows you, when you're looking at your timeline, to know, oh yes, there is something there and I can see it. But if you do indeed put it down to 0, when we look at the timeline and go, it's like, okay, where's my box? I don't know. So I would recommend that you always fade down to about somewhere between 5 and 10%, just enough so you can see it. Because when you go to the next frame and it's gone, nobody will miss it. And it, from 10 to 0, is not a visually jarring kind of color change. So now I've taken my project and created it so it now fades up from black. So it appears that the color is kind of fading in from black, when in fact what's happening is the black is fading out, allowing us to see what's underneath. Remembering that animation is all about illusion and change over time. So I'm creating the illusion. So my artwork changes over time. So we've now faded from black. Now if we want to fade black back to black, well, that's something that I could very easily didn't want to do that. Right here, I can now, if I want to end this so it's gone, so I have emptiness in my timeline, because maybe I'm going to go for 200, 300, 400 frames, we hit F7. That inserts an empty keyframe. Now if I want to kind of fade back to black, then I can hit F7 again right here, drag out a copy of my big black box, and turn into outlines to see if I actually positioned it over the stage, because I can't really tell where, does it go up here, down here. If I just quick click to outlines, I can see that I need to move it down just a little bit. So my box is right here. Now, once again, I can right click on that, create motion tween. Once it's a motion tween, I can extend it out. But see, we don't want to just go to black right away. So I can select the box, hit F6 so it knows, hey, you want to be dark right there. Go to the beginning frame of this. And this area, this blue chunk of frames, is technically referred to as a tween span. So if you remember when I was being scolded earlier, I clicked and it's like, hey, can't do that. Current selection is a tween span, does not support drawing. this collection of frames is a tween span. That's its technical term. So I select it, can go under alpha, put it to 10. Fine, it didn't remember at the end. Go back to 100. So now it fades back to black. So fade up from black, fade out to black. So it creates the illusion that I just changed all of my layers of artwork. Now I could have, every layer in my project is a symbol. So I could have individually applied this same color transformation and made each one of my layers fade to black. But it's much easier just to put a layer on top that's a big black square and fade it in, fade it out, fade it in, fade it out. I'm changing one thing that causes the visual effect of multiple items changing. And you can see how it now creates a nice smooth transition. So that's doing a basic fade. Sorry, recording. Adding my words to my project means grabbing the text tool. And when I grab the text tool, I'm going to choose a different color so it shows up on my black background. So I'll choose white. We can see it defaults to Times Regular as my font choice. Not really my favorite kind of font, so I'm going to choose something with a little more oomph to it. So we'll go for Rockwell today and see. So now if I start, I might need to put it on a new layer though. So now I have a new layer and I can click and type in my awesome project. So positive thinking goes a long ways here, so I would encourage you to work with that. Now that that has been typed in, we can also take and make it bigger or smaller as we need to and work with it. So now that I have put my text here, if I do not have this font on my computer, or you don't have it on your computer, and if I hand this to you, it's not going to work. It will require you to then put your text into a different typeface. Once your project is published, so when it's published as the Swift file, then at that point, the text information is converted to outlines in the published file. So you can work with the text without having to provide the text or convert all your text outlines for publishing. So if you're doing your work and publishing on the same computer where those fonts are installed, then this whole font conversation is meaningless. But when you're giving me your authoring file so that I can open it and review it, if I don't have the same fonts you use, then I'm going to be incapable of seeing your text. So if you go download some super awesome, cool, double, triple awesome typefaces and use those in your project, you better provide those to me. But also what you can do to get around that is we can now take this text and convert it so it's no longer text, but it's just shapes, and work with it that way. And we can do that by going under the Modify pull-down menu, and we can choose Break Apart. The first time I choose Break Apart, what will happen here is it will take each letter and put it into its own text field. As if I grabbed the text tool, typed a letter, clicked off it, clicked again, typed a new letter, clicked off it. So each letter is its own text field. Huge pain to work with unless you're animating the letters. So if you want to animate each letter and fly it in and do cool stuff like that, you're ready to go here and you can do some neat things. And we'll take a look at that. But otherwise, if you're just leaving this as one thing and you know you didn't misspell anything, because once you convert it to outlines, there's no changing the typing. So if you misspell your name or the name of the band or musician who provided the music for your project or the title of your project, and you convert things to outlines, you're screwed. So just throwing that out there. The final thing we do is we can choose Break Apart one more time, and that text now becomes shapes as if I painted these with the brush tool. These are now just simple shapes. So if I look at these, I can click on that shape. That shape I can easily now recolor and do something different with it. They are now shapes. They are no longer text. If I try and select them with the text tool, there is nothing to select because they're not text. They are just shapes that happen to look like letters. Let's see, what is it at now? And there we go. So now I'm back to my text as text. If I take this text and want to animate it the same way I did the black box, I need to convert it to a symbol, hit F8, convert it to a symbol, and then can right-click, choose Motion Tween. And now that I have done that, just zoom out a little bit so I can see what's going on. And I can now have my text, which we'll see that the black fades out. Now I want my text to be there. It needs to fade up because it just seems too dark to begin with. So I'll just choose alpha. At this point, it's at 100%. And now I don't want it at 100% yet. I want to knock it down. Again, I'm going to knock it down to 10% or so. So it's now at 10%. And at this point, when my black background is half faded out, I'm going to take my text and bring it up so it now fades up. And I'm going to, at this point, what works is to hit F6 on the keyboard. It inserts a keyframe of the text at 100%. And now I can take and drop this back down to 10. So what's happened here is it fades up, stays present for a second, and then fades out. If I didn't hit that extra F6 before I faded it out, it would fade up and then immediately start fading out. So I needed to add a keyframe to say, from this keyframe to this keyframe, I want it to stay at 100%. So that's just a little kind of technique or trick to remember while you're working. So it fades up, and now it fades out after the black. So if we watch it, and it never disappears because once it fades out, at that point I can now just hit F, or I can now, come on. Now one thing about it, because I have these extra frames, if I pull that back on, I want to pull it back, well, notice it moved all of my other keyframes. So some of you may have tried to modify the size of a tween span, and it modifies where the keyframes are. It proportionally rearranges them, trying to be helpful, which when you want that to happen, that's so helpful, because if you have like 80 keyframes across a long tween span and you want that tween span, instead of being 100 frames long, to be 60 frames long, you stretch it down and it modifies the keyframes, and you're gold. Versus you having to individually move each one back over time, which is kind of how we used to have to do it old school. So, but what I can do, if I decide this is the end, I can just highlight these frames and hit Shift F5 on the keyboard, and now, then those frames go away, and then we're in good shape. So again, Shift F5 is how we can get rid of frames. So it fades up, goes out, up, fades out, and now it's gone. So we can do that with the title. Now, I hesitate to show the next thing, but I might as well, just for fun.
You're gonna hurt people.
So if I wanted to create something like exploding text, so I have this text here that I'm working with. Now, if I want this text to explode, if I break it apart once, where it turns each letter into its own text field, I'm going to lock every layer that's not part of this. And now, what I can actually choose is I can go right-click, and there's this cool option with these multiple objects on a layer. If I choose Distribute to Layers, it did something crazy. It put each letter on its own layer. With each letter on its own layer, I could convert them all to symbols, but text is like it has some of the properties and rights of a symbol. So I can even now, at this point, I can right-click and say Create Motion Tween. And I can do that. Whoa, let's back down. And now that I have done that, So I have all those letters that are there. So they're starting in that position. Let's make sure everything else is locked. Select. You hit F6, so I know that's where I want them to end. I want my text. Oh, sorry. This is exploding text. This isn't going to be come together text. If I want my text to explode now, you can just go like this. Drag the E out to here. Drag the X over to here. You can go to a different place in time. Drag the P. Different place in time. The O. Maybe grab this E over to here. And if we look, we'll see how the text is starting to explode. Kind of like your brains might do if you start playing with some of this. But the key thing is we can now move it around. And when it's all done, to control it, all we have to do is adjust where those keyframes are. We set keyframes and move keyframes for your artwork, and then you're able to create the animation. That's what it takes. It's just a matter of tweaking the timing with the artwork that is on screen and doing your best to let the computer help you. And then hopefully you will have some degree of success and sanity when the process is done.